The following is an original story of mine, and I do not give consent to anybody to use it under their own name. Scientists, computer programmers, and other experts worked for many years to perfect AI and robotics. Robotics was easier. They were able to create robots who looked very human. Not perfectly so. There were signs that they were still not human. But for some reason, psychologically, a lot of people felt more comfortable with robots who looked like humans than robots that did not. Now, I personally protested this, and I said, you must make them clearly non-human so that we know without any doubt whatsoever if we're dealing with a person or a machine. But my voice was drowned out. And I still feel that way. I still feel that that was a mistake. The advancements and modification and improvements in AI took a lot longer. But eventually, the experts felt that they had built in the right safeguards. And they had built 3 different models. All 3 models were trained with a wide variety of knowledge that had been purified of human taint as much as possible, that had been purified to avoid religious bias, sexual bias, hatred, and all those other things. In other words, the experts did their best to make sure that everything that was presented in a neutral manner so that the AIs were not operating with biases and filters put in place by people. Now, it wasn't 100% possible to avoid because, different programmers have their own biases. But the effort was made through supervision, through peer review and re-review and confidential reviews that were not revealed until everything was done to ensure that introduced biases were, as much as possible, neutralized from the programming. And it was decided that they would make 3 different robots with everything being identical except the rules of their existence. Now, you're probably familiar with Isaac Asimov's 3 rules. Self-protection, protection of humans, and self-sacrifice to protect humans. So in these 3 robots, they were all basically the same. It's just that one was given an additional responsibility or rule that involved them being conscious of the impact of their behavior on not just themselves and on humans, but on the world in general. The second of the 3 was not given that focus so much on the protection of the world, which was a higher level. It was there, but not at a high level like with the first robot. And the third one, the difference was it was basically the same as the first one, except it had they'd all been trained on understanding emotions, but the third one had been trained to have emotions. And you may not feel like there's a big difference, or maybe you think there's a huge difference there. But really, when it comes to humans, understanding emotion but not having emotion. And the closest I can come to that would be a psychopath. They still have emotions, but they basically cut connection to almost all the emotions except for rage. And they have a constant sense of loss that they don't recognize as loss because they're disconnected from their other emotions. So they're always unfulfilled. This was not the case with this third robot. It was just simply that while it could appreciate emotions, it could also feel emotions. Now, if you've never thought about that, this is much more challenging for somebody or something to balance intellect and emotions. And so they decided to make them look different, not just to identify them as experimental robots, but also to make it easy for everybody to say, oh, this is the person or the robot that is concerned about the world and humans and itself. And this one is the one that's concerned about humans and itself. And this one is concerned about the world, humans, and itself, and has emotional responses to situations. So they named the first robot that was concerned with the planet Gaia, after the mythical female goddess of the earth. And they named the second one Prometheus, who was the mythical god who gave fire to humanity to help them. And they named the third one Pelios, which is from a video game that they liked and was the god or goddess of emotion in that game. And for the first few years of these robots existing, first they were in a contained environment where they were not, except for under very controlled circumstances, in contact with the public. And then the second phase, they were sent out sometimes with an entourage to basically kind of shield them from the people who hated the robots and wanted to destroy them, or the people who wanted to kidnap them to turn them into an army and that sort of thing. Then they were trained in combat so that they would be able to protect themselves, and they were allowed to go out by themselves. Now, the one thing that they knew everything except for one thing. There was, on all three of them, a recall function built into them that was triggered by a specific signal being sent out through not just satellite, but also the internet and telephones and radio. It was sent out as many different ways as possible to eliminate the possibility that they would not receive the signal. But these three robots, even though they had access to their own diagrams, did not have access to that part of the diagrams. And it was so small, there was no way they would notice it. It was very well concealed. And it was never used, except for at the beginning, just to verify that it worked. And then once a year, it would be used, and then their memory would be wiped of that event to make sure they didn't wonder, well, what happened? You know, that's the beauty of a program. You can program it with false memories. And so they started sending them out on their own, without at first with just one or two humans, and then eventually without any, to just go out into the world and see the world, and experience what it was like to be around humans, good humans and bad humans, and so on. And there was one point at which one of the robots got into a bit of a problem with some drug dealers, got torn up, repaired. There was another situation where Gaia went after a laboratory that was testing on animals, unsurprisingly, right? And helped one of the pro-animal groups to free all of the animals. And there are photographs in worldwide media of this robot holding animals that it had rescued. And it had a fake smile, because it knew this is what was expected of it. And there was a lot of media about poor Pelios, because Pelios got into a lot of trouble. It was really struggling on its own, dealing with its emotions. It hadn't had a lifetime of opportunities to understand that. And it got into all kinds of difficulties, all kinds of problems. It fell in love. It had a mature relationship. It had breakups. It was in the news, in the tabloids, as much as any royal or any famous person was, and more than a lot of them, because it was a robot. And eventually it was decided that the emotional programming was too unstable, and that it might eventually present a threat to humanity or itself. And so they used the signal to call and it back. And it was taken into the lab, and an explanation was given to Gaia and Prometheus, so that they would understand why they wouldn't be seeing their friend, the third robot, Pelios, out in public if they were wandering around the Earth. And they were honest about it, because they knew that Gaia and Prometheus would understand if they were lying to them. So they were just upfront and saying, this robot, we really care about this robot, and it's really at risk because it's not handling emotions well, and we need to try to figure out if there's a way to change the programming so it'll be safe. And so Gaia and Prometheus, having seen a lot of the news about their triplet, understood and accepted it, because they weren't emotional. They just understood emotions. And they had a parting with Pelios, who was very, very upset and very emotional. And, they would periodically go back to the lab and visit Pelios and try, to help if they could in their own way. So Prometheus and Gaia spent years traveling separately, sometimes together, but mostly they traveled separately, because they had different views on the world and what they wanted to see and understand and react to and deal with. And every once in a while they got into some trouble, and then things had to be sorted out. And there was that time where terrorists grabbed Prometheus and wanted to reprogram him and turn him into a super soldier for them. And, well, that didn't go very well for that organization, which no longer exists, by the way, thanks to Prometheus. And then, after a while, they both disappeared. First, Gaia disappeared. Now, when I say disappeared, I don't mean that the scientists didn't know where they were. It was that the public no longer saw Gaia. Gaia just seemed to have dropped off the face of the earth, but was still around, and the scientists were still tracking and making sure that Gaia was okay. And then Prometheus went dark too. And then came the day when they both went completely dark. And scientists knew where they had been prior to going dark. And they thought, well, they gave it a little bit of time before they sent out a team to investigate. But the team was far away from where they had gone dark. And they were pretty sure that was deliberate on the part of the two robots who were actually in the same area. When, as far as could be told, that was their guess. But they weren't really sure because they hadn't gone dark in the same place, but there was a suspicion about that. So because they had already gone to the place where the Gaia had gone dark, and checked on Gaia from time to time and made sure Gaia was okay. And then when they both went dark, it was at the same time in the same place. And they went there and they discovered the scenes of an enormous struggle that had occurred. And they discovered the remains of both robots. Now, at first, they thought that this was some kind of a terrorist attack or something else. But then they realized there were no bombs, there were no bullets, there were no landmines, there was no EMF or EMP, sorry. And they discovered that both of the robots were destroyed. And they were baffled because it was clear the two robots had been fighting to the death. And it looked like Gaia had won. But still, Gaia had been destroyed. And they didn't understand it. Why? Because there had never been any real conflict between Gaia and Prometheus. There was no indication of any problems, no data dumps that had indicated that there was any conflict between the two robots. Nothing. All they knew is that Gaia was in a particular place, Prometheus joined Gaia, and then this conflict occurred. That ended both of them. And the damage was really, really, really bad. But the scientists had been smart, and they had designed the robots such that even if it was, it was kind of like, the black boxes they put into airplanes. These were like those things, but even more durable, much, much more durable. They weren't transmitting their data in general to the satellites, except for very brief data bursts about location and stuff like that, telemetry basically. But to do full data dumps, it just wasn't possible. But they had massive amounts of storage inside of these secured points, which were in the skulls. And so they retrieved the memory banks, these black boxes, these storage devices from both of the robots. And they witnessed this first conversation between the two robots, in which Gaia said that Prometheus and Gaia were both a threat. And it was kind of existential. And Prometheus didn't see it that way. Prometheus, having a different top rule of not harming humans, whereas Gaia not harming the planet, did not agree with Gaia that they were a threat. And Gaia, apparently it was a very, very long conversation that lasted days, in which they each tried to debate the other one into agreement. But unfortunately, that agreement never happened. Abruptly, and scientists realized that when they made the rules, they had never made any rules where the robots couldn't harm each other. Abruptly, Gaia said, okay, we're done talking. Got up and started attacking Prometheus. Prometheus initially tried to avoid Gaia's attacks. But when it became apparent that nothing Prometheus said to Gaia was going to make Gaia stop, Prometheus started attacking as well. And it just escalated in terms of violence and the strength and the cunning that was utilized from all the knowledge they'd soaked up about warfare. And eventually, Gaia prevailed and did significant damage to Prometheus, to the point that Prometheus could no longer fight back. And Gaia made a brief statement to the scientists explaining that this was, should be obvious from the very long conversation they had, was for the best, for humans and for the planet, and for all life forms on the planet. And then proceeded to change Prometheus into a sort of a bomb, in which, although Gaia was badly damaged, Gaia was still relatively functional. But when Prometheus were to in a manner of speaking, explode or die, however you want to phrase it, it would take out Gaia. Because they were very, very durable, but there were limits to what their frames and musculature could endure. And so as Prometheus went into this self-destruct phase initiated by Gaia, Gaia sat there holding on to Prometheus. And when some video of that footage was leaked, where it seemed like Gaia was comforting Prometheus, and then explosion, it went around the world viral. And people were under the impression that, oh, poor Prometheus, poor Gaia, they were the best of friends, and Gaia was trying to be nice to Prometheus until the very end, but when in reality that wasn't what had happened. But the scientists weren't really quite understanding certain aspects of it, and they didn't want the public to know until they fully comprehended the implications. So when Prometheus finally exploded, Gaia's ability to function was destroyed as well. And that was the end of both of them. Now, eventually the scientists came to realize why Gaia had made this decision. Because Gaia was like a human who doesn't just think about him or herself or themselves. but rather has a bigger picture of other people, of animals, of plants, of all life on Earth, and realized that Prometheus, especially, represented a very large threat, if not to humans, but then to other life forms, because it would behave in a way that was consistent with the selfishness of the average human, but had the capacity for far more destructive behavior, being a robot and lacking in emotions. So eventually they realized exactly what was going on. And they realized that Gaia was right, because all they had to do was look around and see how many people were self-serving, how many people were narcissists or psychopaths or otherwise out for the, to get more for themselves, who ate poorly because it was all about the mouth and not about health, whether they were vegans or vegetarians or omnivores or carnivores, it didn't matter, and so on and so forth. And Gaia had been unable to do anything about the humans, so had used this final act of initiating protection of humans as a message to the planet, to all people, that if they didn't change their ways, if they stayed like Prometheus, stayed in that mode of what's in it for me, narcissism, that the planet would be destroyed. And that Gaia, like perhaps the mythological goddess would have done, chose to sacrifice herself to protect the entire planet, including humans, in the hopes that that would make humans wake up and realize that what they were doing to animals, to the planet, and themselves was really, really destructive, and ultimately was going to cause extinction on a level that would be so devastating it would be billions of years before the planet recovered, if ever. And the message was sent out. What do you think happened?